Sonic Mania released in 2017 to thunderous fanfare from both the public at large as well as newer and older enjoyers of the franchise. The soundtrack bops, the art is juicy, the animation quality is fresh. Mania is the best of Genesis-era Sonic condensed into a completely new package. Yet I finished the whole experience with only a single question percolating in the back of my mind. Where does 2D Sonic go from here? This is not a video about Sonic's origins. This is not a video about aesthetics. We are here to discuss the future of 2D Sonic. And while I won't bore you with this history, it is important to know where the game design began, what it got right, what feels archaic, and where I believe it should go. Game inclusion won't be exhaustive. For example, I won't be discussing the 8-bit Game Gear games like Sonic Chaos or Triple Trouble. Sorry, Noah and Andy. Or spin-off titles like Spinball. I will, however, include the 2.5D gameplay of Generations, as this attempts to honor the 2D gameplay with 3D visuals. Throughout the video, we'll take stock of what the games have done well, what is old and needs refreshing rather than rehashing, and what I believe needs to be innovated on.
How'd that get in there?
There are many elements which separate Mario from Sonic, like design and characterization, world setting and musical numbers, but most fundamentally their respective approaches to game design. I draw upon this comparison due to Mario being the platforming mascot of his time and Sonic being a direct response to Nintendo's flagship character by Sega. While Mario does indeed have a slight amount of physics to his movement, Sonic embraces this direction completely. Sonic was the introduction of a true momentum-based platformer. Mario's lack of emphasis on physics funnels the game into being a precision platformer, with jumps requiring tighter inputs, platforms being smaller compared to Sonic's, and mastery of the game showcasing an exploitation of mechanics rather than exploiting Mario's speed. Sonic leans heavily into its physics and encourages players to memorize level layouts to more efficiently clear zones on repeat playthroughs. Sonic is a tad more unwieldy than Mario, with a slower ramp up to top speed and more time to turn around and even falling down slopes without enough speed. Beginning in a limber jog, Sonic builds up to a run which sees his legs rotating over his body like a pinwheel on a rodent. Let's call this his default run state. Sonic has a speed cap in the first title. Future titles would remove the speed cap whereby Sonic can reach the maximum speed when being influenced by the downward angles of his environment. I believe a speed cap is healthy if you want players to remain in control, but unhealthy if the priority is player agency. If you don't enjoy how it all works here, future titles in the same vein probably won't change your mind. At any given moment, the player can know what their score is, rings they've collected, how many lives they have, and see a moderate amount of the level via the camera. Performing various tasks like killing badniks and destroying objects, collecting rings, as well as completing levels quickly, contribute to an increasing score. 50 rings collected in a special stage awards a continue. Lives being counters for the amount of deaths you can experience, and continues being counters for game over screens you're allowed to see. Pixel art of this time does not play nice with zooming in and out, mostly being designed for the screen size as is. This means while a 16:9 field of view is possible, zooming in or out dynamically would ruin the art. We get a glimpse of this effect in Sonic Mania's Metallic Madness Zone. The biggest problem is the camera's static position sets players up for failure, especially first-time players. There is not enough visual information on screen at certain speeds for players to react in time to obstacles, hazards, or badniks. This problem is doubled when level design elements are placed purposefully to hurt oncoming players zipping through it. Only previous playthroughs will impact how you play. I'm of the opinion players should be empowered enough to react to this their first go-around, even if it's a tight window. As is, most players will run into hazards designed to thwart their speed. This claustrophobic camera will remain a thorn in the classics, and while charming on repeat playthroughs, comparing it to modern platformers sticks out as cumbersome and deadly. Sonic can enter a roll state, not unlike a tire going down a highway. You can't stop it, simply watch it fly away and break into stuff. During a roll, Sonic's speed can only be influenced by slopes, not player inputs, but players can eject the roll state by jumping and returning to a default run state. Jumps are also handy for changing speed and direction, as Sonic's airspeed is more flexible than his ground speed. Sonic can jump on or roll into enemies and item monitors to break them. If the player holds the jump button when hitting a badnik or item box, Sonic will recoil higher than if not held. Future titles will add to Sonic's arsenal in a way that coming back to play this first title feels incomplete. The overall goal can be described using the definition of parkour, moving from A to B as efficiently as possible, or left to right as efficiently as possible. Levels are called zones, with each zone containing 2 acts with a twirling signpost signifying the end of that act, and a boss at the end of the 3rd act. Activating the signpost and defeating Dr. Eggman's machinations are the ultimate goal if you want to clear the game and see the credits. Entering special stages with the buy-in of 50 rings at the end of Act 1 or 2 will give players the opportunity to collect a Chaos Emerald. Collecting 6 of these will trigger an alternate good ending to the story as well as an accompanying graphic. Collecting less than 6 does not result in failure, merely a taunting from one rotund scientist. The feeling of completing and overcoming any platforming game has its own dopamine hit, but the lack of true purpose for Chaos Emeralds in Sonic 1 has a shallow feeling to collecting all of them. Sonic 1 opens to its most iconic level, which needs no introduction. It is here players get a taste of how the mechanics and controls are best put into practice, with looping terrain, breakable walls, items hidden around, perfectly placed jumps and rolls giving players a sense of mastery. Unfortunately, the rest of Sonic 1 falls short, with levels coming after this initial high leaving a vast want in their wake for more of the same. The worst offender being Labyrinth Zone, which beyond its tedium, adds water which slows Sonic down and can outright kill him given enough time. Underwater levels in Sonic games will be the same burdensome bore going forward, seeing a glimmer of hope in Sonic 3. Besides Green Hill and Starlight Zone, levels are standard platform fare a la Mario, taking very little advantage of Sonic's unique gameplay experience and making these more precise sections a chore. Needless to say, Sonic 1 laid the foundation for a sequel to take better advantage of its physical gameplay, separating Sonic from the pack of platform mascots in his time. But before we move on to its sequel, let's deep dive into what makes Sonic tick, getting into the nitty-gritty, beginning with the interface and information given to the player. We immediately notice a few things. For starters, a clock begins to tick in the top left corner of the screen, counting up how long the player has been in the stage. Though in functionality, this is a countdown. When the 10-minute mark is reached, Sonic will abruptly die, taking a life and resetting the score. In Sonic CD, Sonic will become impatient, leaving the map after 3 minutes of inactivity from the player and considered a game over. A game over can also be reached when the player's lives deplete. It's at this screen a continue can be used to resume Act 1 of the zone players lost their lives to. These may have been healthy at the time of release when arcade machines were still around, but played in the present day feels so incredibly dated and bogged down the flow of failures, having players completely restart the game in Sonic 1 and 2 when a game over is reached. Sonic's main platforming collectibles are rings. Only a single ring is needed for Sonic to remain alive after being hit. If Sonic is struck by an enemy with at least one ring collected, Sonic will lose that ring, setting it flying and the player scampering to collect while Sonic blinks with invincibility a brief moment, giving players time to find their bearings. The more rings collected, the more spray out. If Sonic touches a badnik or environment hazard with no rings, Sonic will die, resulting in a lost life and restarting the player at the previous checkpoint. At 50 rings, Sonic will have access to a giant ring at the end of an act, save for boss levels. This is true for Sonic 1 and CD. Sonic 2 requires 50 rings to access its special stages available at its checkpoints, also called star posts. In Sonic 3, giant rings are located throughout each level, hidden in areas off the beaten path. This rewards players who are curious and spare the extra time and skill to find them. However, this directly cheapens the purpose of rings, as you no longer need them as a means of access to special stages. They now serve solely as a means of staying alive or collecting enough for an extra life, neither of which makes rings valuable and your collection of them in plenty meaningless. Once Sonic's more powerful forms are accessible via the Chaos Emeralds post-Sonic 1, rings are both timer and a gatekeep, with 50 rings minimum required to transform, each ring being 1 second of super form, thus 50 seconds of gameplay. This makes the value of rings very hot or cold, resulting in a lukewarm purpose for their collection throughout the Genesis titles. Special stages are mini-game obstacle courses where players who are successful are rewarded with a cosmic jewel at the end. In Sonic 1, traveling through a giant ring portals Sonic into a nightmarish trip of a frustrating, rotating puzzle game which rewards you with a Chaos Emerald if one makes it to the center of the puzzle and the music doesn't put you to sleep first. Sonic 2 picks up the pace by throwing Sonic and Tails into a pseudo-3D psychedelic half-pipe filled with bombs and spikes. To reach the end, you'll have to collect rings in increasing amounts and avoid the hazards to be awarded with a Chaos Emerald. If you collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds available throughout the game, Sonic will have access to Super Sonic, a ring-based power trip reminiscent of DBZ's Super Saiyan for Goku. In Sonic CD, Pseudo 3D returns with a buy-in of 50 rings at the end of a level. Players have a third-person view of Sonic in slippery control to destroy all the UFOs before the time runs out. Yes, UFOs. When 20 seconds remain on the clock, an additional UFO will appear which will grant 10 more seconds to the player when destroyed. Hazards will cause Sonic to lose rings, which are meaningless, save for a score tally at the end, but the time lost getting back up is detrimental. Stepping in water quickly drains time. Avoid the water at all costs. Standard blue UFOs make Sonic run faster. Destroying all these buggers is cumbersome but incredibly satisfying. I'm both relieved and bummed this never came back as a special stage. Collecting the 7th time stone does not result in a fun power trip for the player. Instead, it's emotional payoff for giving Little Planet a, quote, good future. I feel warm and fuzzy inside just thinking about it. In Sonic 3 and Knuckles, there are a total of 14 emeralds to collect. The first 7 can be collected in giant rings scattered throughout the zones prior to the 7th zone. Giant rings bring Sonic into a checker pattern globe that rotates as the player moves. The goal is to collect all the blue spheres to be awarded with a Chaos Emerald. The longer a player remains in a stage, regardless of the amount of spheres collected, the faster Sonic moves, the more challenging and twitchy the minigame becomes. The first 7 emeralds grant access to Super Sonic. If players are both skilled at the special stage called Blue Spheres and know where the giant rings are, it's possible to obtain Super Sonic as early as the 2nd zone. Once Mushroom Hill Zone is reached, the 7th level, Sonic's next trip through a giant ring will abandon the collected emeralds into the currently deactivated Super Emeralds. Each Super Emerald is a new, more challenging than the first 7 Blue Sphere stage. After the 7 Super Emeralds are collected, Sonic can now turn to Hypersonic, to date his most powerful form, making levels a breeze, but the trouble of acquiring this highly rewarding. But if you don't have access to these more powerful forms, what does Sonic have access to in his world? There are 5 item boxes located throughout Sonic's adventure: Invincibility, Barrier, Power Sneakers, Life Box, and Super Ring. Invincibility grants a sphere of sparkly stars to protect Sonic for a brief time, accompanied by a dedicated jingle. Barrier provides Sonic with a shield, allowing Sonic to be hit a single time, sending him into a recoil invincibility state before being vulnerable to ring loss again. Power Sneakers gives Sonic a boost of speed, accompanied with a separate tune before wearing off. Life Boxes provide players with an immediate +1 to their life count.
Yes!
Ring Boxes are 10 rings in a box. In Sonic 3, elemental shields are introduced: fire, electric, and water. Fire shields on Sonic give players a short burst forward by pressing jump airborne, as well as providing immunity to flames. Similar in activation, electric shields give Sonic a double jump after pressing jump again, have a slight ring magnetism drawing nearby rings in, and invulnerability to electrical hazards. Bubble shields thrust Sonic downward and make him recoil a bit higher. They also provide underwater breathing, very helpful for hydrocity. All 3 shields negate enemy projectiles, however anything else that would regularly hurt Sonic will remove them off the player. Checkpoints are scattered throughout the levels, only requiring a brief pass to activate. Numerous checkpoints cannot be activated at once, and previous checkpoints will be deactivated permanently. In Sonic 2, approaching a checkpoint with 50 rings will give players access to the special stages. In Sonic 3, checkpoints give access to bonus stages. These are risk-free trials where players can acquire shields, rings, and life. Bear with me, I'm about to go on a bit of a rant. Underwater levels have notoriously been a pain point in platformers. The reduction of move speed, access to abilities, and vulnerabilities to enemies who are better suited to navigate the aquatic all contribute to a feeling of frustration when playing them. In Mario, for example, an entirely new gameplay is introduced. The player now floats slowly downwards but can quickly paddle upwards when jump is pressed. The biggest frustration with this design is no locomotive control over their downward movement, meaning a mistimed jump underwater near an enemy that's faster than you has no course corrective option, removing agency from the player and guaranteeing getting hit. In Sonic, however, the player has full access to Sonic's abilities and moveset at the cost of overall speed and, admittedly, enjoyment of the game. The hit to momentum and speed makes traversing these otherwise normal platforming sections into tedium with no redeeming qualities like, say, access to new abilities or being able to make quick work of underwater baddies by riding a swordfish a la Donkey Kong Country. There's an additional aspect to Sonic's underwater escapades most other platformers lack, which can lead to a legitimate sense of anxiety: a timer on how long the player can breathe underwater. Players will have to find air bubble dispensers throughout the terrain to refill this invisible oxygen tank. That is, of course, you both make it to the bubble dispenser in time and it bothers to release when you need it. It's completely impossible to find a bubble dispenser with 2 seconds on the clock left, only to have your saving grace completely abandon you, your anxiety reinforced by the sounds of Sonic drowning, and the music's existential notes. Sonic 2 has numerous areas of the game which involve frustrating underwater sections. Take, for example, Chemical Plant Act 2's infamous Caterpillar block section, which you will die to, oxygen not included, if it's not performed on the first try. Aquatic Ruin Zone's underwater areas have both frustrating platforming sections, as well as frustrating placement of badniks and hazards, as if to purposely drown players. Sonic 3 applies some allo to this sort with the introduction of the Bubble Shield, which allows players to breathe underwater indefinitely and have access to a new ability. A good change, which makes its de facto water level, hydrocity, an overall more enjoyable experience than, say, a Tidal Tempest in Sonic CD. However, if you lose the Bubble Shield to a hazard or badnik, you're back at a vanilla Sonic 1 labyrinthian experience. Thankfully, platformers have come after, which prove underwater gameplay can be fun and empowering. 3 games come to mind, all which sought to solve these woes, arriving at the same conclusion: the recent Rayman games, the Ori games, and Grease, which if you haven't played, please do, it's honestly amazing. Instead of slowing players down and sinking them to the bottom like Skeletons and Pirates of the Caribbean, these games give players entirely new kits designed specifically to navigate underwater sections. Rayman, Ori, and Grease all behave like dolphins or fish while in water, rotating and swimming over themselves gracefully in the direction the players aim. They all have some sort of underwater boost movement to destroy, avoid, or interact with the environment, and whether it's via power-up like in Grease and Ori, or inherent to the game like Rayman, players will not need to worry about oxygen management. These levels are legitimately fun to experience, and players have complete agency over how they handle each interaction or tackle obstacles. Of course, with this change in movement comes more challenging hazards, but the fundamental changes in underwater gameplay dictate how you navigate these changes in level design. I'll cover my ideas for how Sonic should evolve in regards to controlling underwater towards the end of the video. If there's one thing we can say about all water levels, the music never disappoints. Let's move on to the release of Sonic 2, where we find a game which understands what made the first such a unique experience. The levels are organized way more around Sonic's movement, taking advantage of both his inertia and player memorization. Sonic now has a spin dash, a powerful ability which allows him to rev up to a high speed and take off like a shot with a combo press of down and jump. This is a welcome addition, as rolling quickly in the first game required a well-placed hill, but now, players can freely spin Sonic around at the speed of sound. Sonic 2 also makes changes to the special stages, seeing them move to checkpoints and no longer requiring a ticket stub at the end of the level, but a buy-in of 50 rings is still needed. Significantly, there are now 7 Chaos Emeralds to collect, whereby with all 7 and 50 rings in pocket, the titular short and limber main character will burst into a fury of rage, vibrating his spikes and frosting the tips. This is Super Sonic.
Like you wanna, and most importantly, I'm free in all the ways that you are not.
Super Sonic is much faster and invulnerable to anything except being crushed. As previously mentioned, 50 rings are the gatekeep and time gauge for how long you get to experience this fun, empowered state. If the ring count drops to 0, Sonic will turn back into an ordinary slow-mo and be vulnerable to death.
I'm just an ordinary slow-mo.
Unfortunately, Sonic 2's level quality falls off as the game progresses. The final level deliberately places badniks in areas to trip up players new to its layout. Designing difficult levels should be less about cheap-shotting players and more about testing reflexes and precision. All of those swirling loops and set-piece moments are missing from the moment-to-moment gameplay in the final sections of the game. The final boss is epic and a good challenge, though a game over will restart the game from Emerald Hill Zone, once again making the blight of lives and continues that much more obvious. Not even Mega Man treated players this roughly. Thankfully, a solid sequel was followed up with an even stronger third entry, making the Genesis mainline Sonic trilogy an unforgettable experience in the platformer genre. But first, we need to talk about Sonic 2's cousin released shortly after. Sonic CD. A spin-off of the main franchise releasing shortly after Sonic 2, places a large emphasis on exploration, with the main gimmick of the game being a time travel mechanic which changes various level designs and swaps paths around on you as you move through time and space to destroy numerous objectives. Sonic CD introduces the Peel Out, a charged ability able to send Sonic zipping at high speeds with the combination press up plus jump for a brief moment. The spin dash is also borrowed from Sonic 2, though it's neutered and cannot be revved in the initial release. This was fixed in Whitehead's remaster of the classics, unifying the spin dash mechanic across Sonic 1, 2, and CD. Where Sonic CD suffers the most is its obvious lack of set-piece moments and rolling hill level design found prevalent in the franchise's introduction and Sonic 2. Instead, CD level design is almost the average Mario level, with slower, chunkier sections which are more frustrating than challenging and more tedious than fun. The game encourages exploration, but still sets time limits on how long players can be idle, and even killing Sonic if they take too long. So much for enjoying the scenery. You may not need 10 minutes to complete a single stage, but the weight of a timer that can kill you is anxiety I did not need as a kid. Instead of Chaos Emeralds, players are encouraged to go back to the past using an appropriately labeled signpost. Build up enough speed to warp through the time-space continuum, destroy generators and metal Sonic holograms, or collect all 7 time stones before the game is over to get a quote good ending. The game's emphasis on exploration is appreciated, and this game has a ton of heart. But the core level design experience is a chore, with very little in the way of Sonic running fast, rolling through terrain, save for the first level. Sound familiar? Sonic 3 would capitalize on the past 3 entries to create a completely unique Sonic experience. Sonic 3, also known as Sonic 3 and Knuckles, due to the game being separated into 2 cartridges at launch, Sonic 3 and Sonic Knuckles respectively, has a great blend of exploration, momentum-based platforming, and levels which help all tell a story. Zones are a wonderful blend of set pieces, but also have more precise moments involving tight platforming, or, dedicated entire levels to this. These momentary draughts and otherwise competent level design are offset by how well paced the entire experience is. The end of each act has brief, unique transitions which help propel the story forward, helping players look forward to each new level. I know Marble Garden gets a bad rap, and it's really not fun to play your first go-around, but the boss at the end really makes it all worth it. Everything about the game is so subtly cinematic. Special stage rings are now found in nooks and crannies of the levels rather than gate-kept by a ring quantity. This gives players a direct incentive to explore. Item boxes make a return with the introduction of previously mentioned elemental shields. Without shields, Sonic can outperform the insta-shield by pressing jump again, extending Sonic's hitbox and granting him brief invulnerability. This is great for boss fights, which may be too far for Sonic to reach initially, or dealing with pesky enemies with tougher outer shells. Sonic separates himself from Mario by asking players to balance the paradox of treading carefully and masterful execution. This is Genesis Sonic. After Sonic 3, it would be 7 years before a 2D Sonic game was released. Sonic Advance would prove not only be commercially successful but beloved by the fans. On the heels of Sonic's rough transition to 3D,
He said it! He said it!
I'm only slightly kidding. Sonic Advance seeks to revitalize energy into 2D Sonic with new designs, locations, and a fresh perspective on his gameplay. Sonic Advance would include new ways for Sonic and friends to maintain momentum with the inclusion of mechanics like sliding and tricking, gimmicks like rail grinding, ramps, and boost pads, taking cues from the Adventure series. A total of 3 entries would be made, all sharing similar scope and vision for how characters handle. The emphasis on speed rather than platforming contributes to a level design philosophy which asks to hold your hand while crossing the street. Where the Advanced series has its biggest pitfalls is its actual pitfalls. Large portions of the levels are cheapened by bottomless pits or instant kill death planes. This is not new to the franchise, but its abundance here, especially in early levels, feels lazy and cheap, rather than an obvious spike in difficulty as we approach the end of the game. Each successive entry would further the emphasis on speed and handholding rather than platforming, and continue to introduce bottomless pits as annoying hazards. It's here in the Advanced series where we see developer Dimps, a name which will live in infamy later, finally tackle one of the biggest issues with the Genesis titles, the camera. Despite Advance being a pixel art game, the inclusion of gimmicks designed to make Sonic go even faster means they'd have to move the camera around. Their solution is to move Sonic to the opposite side of where he's going, placing obstacles in the middle of the screen rather than Sonic, allowing the player a bit more leeway to react to oncoming obstacles. With genuine attempts to inject a fresh feel for 2D gameplay, albeit at the cost of level design focused on speed rather than mastery, and addressing the elephant in the room named Camera the Elephant, Dimps seemed like a golden child for 2D Sonic titles to come. Right? After the Sonic Advance trilogy, Studio Dimps collaborated with Sonic Team to create Sonic Rush, which saw the return of many Advance's design choices and the introduction of the boost mechanic, a mainstay of 3D going forward. In the top left, we still see indicators for life count and ring amount, as well as a new bar to indicate how full the boost meter is. Levels have mostly removed the bottomless pits in favor of more streamlined levels, showcasing Sonic's new boost mechanic in favor of more set-piece moments at the cost of player decision-making. Tricking off ramps now builds boost meter, giving players a reason to look cool and be rewarded for doing so. The lack of meaningful platforming sections means levels, aside from aesthetic, blend together, with gimmicks being more for show than interaction or gameplay shakeup. This isn't directly antithetical to Sonic, as many gimmicks of old have contributed to Sonic maintaining speed, but the one seen here in Rush seemed like a consolation rather than intentional design, primarily serving as a way to boost again, watch your screen more, and push less buttons. Again, not a bad thing, but it just makes levels feel overall less distinct and memorable when they're all designed to play similarly. The introduction of Boost, rather than empowering players, strips them of decision-making, funneling players to focus on boost meter accumulation with the levels feeding into this encouragement. Sonic used to be about fast and skillful platforming, but Rush feels more just like fast. 3 years later, Studio Dimps would attempt to carry the mantle of Sonic 3 in an obviously titled Sonic 4 Episode 1, implying numerous installments would come, a hot industry trend just blossoming at its time. The game would be advertised as a return to form, acknowledging the Genesis era of titles and attempting to recreate the glory that once was.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the decision to go back to the old school roots?
You know, over a year ago, the idea came about to do a 2D game. And then, of course, the natural reaction was, if we're going to do a 2D side-scrolling game, it has to be Sonic 4.
What certain things are the fans demanding are in a Sonic side-scrolling game?
The feeling is key to this. Obviously, you want momentum-style gameplay, platforming, Sonic has to go fast, but the reality is it has to feel like a Genesis game made today. And as long as you hit that feeling, I think that fans are going to be happy.
However, Dimps fell short of this tall order. Very short. For starters, Sonic's locomotion feels incorrect. Players can stop abruptly while running and remain on slanted ground, completely void of physical weight. Rolling breaks the game and does not build momentum downhill properly. Spin dash jumping, a technique available in the previous games whereby players jump immediately after revving, is devoid of actual inertia, almost like Sonic hits an invisible wall when leaving the ground. Levels are left-to-right experiences with very little in the way of exploration. The homing attack, a staple of 3D Sonic, is introduced as a part of 2D Sonic's repertoire, but it doesn't feel at home here. It lacks positive changes for the 2D experience, instead continuing the hand-holding experience the Rush games got into the bad habit of. Chaining homing attacks is a matter of pressing jump over and over and over again until it's complete. It's like Thanksgiving dinner, you don't want to, you just have to. Springs can also be targeted, continuing a constant feeling of a lack of agency. No decisions really have to be made as very little control is needed to complete the levels. They almost just play themselves if you press jump and hold right. 7 Chaos Emeralds and a Supersonic unlock also return, little consolation for how the rest of the game feels to play. Supersonic makes already easy levels a breeze to blast through, but his inclusion is always a fun one. Sonic 4 Episode 1 did very little to advance anything about 2D Sonic, and at times feels like a total regression of what Sonic Advance and especially Sonic 3 set up for the studio to work off of. Sonic 4 Episode 2 doesn't do much to improve or fix the design choices in the first episode. The same locomotion engine which powers Sonic's movement in Episode 1 is back, but the inclusion of Tails now gives players access to special abilities performed alongside the trusty sidekick. These, however, can hardly be called organic in execution, leading to a stifling of flow in the level design and removing control from players' hands over and over again. While new power-ups and abilities are appreciated, these feel, once again, ham-fisted into the game and not a healthy inclusion. After the release of Sonic 4 Episodes 1 and 2, which were cancelled after the second installment, fans of the classic era would wait half a decade before Sonic reclaimed a seat at the table of respected 2D platformers. In between Sonic 4's episodes, Sonic Generations was released, a celebration of vintage and recent gameplay, Sega delineating for themselves the differences between classic and modern Sonic for the first time. Much of classic Sonic stages are rehashed callbacks preying upon the nostalgia of Genesis enjoyers such as myself, but falls flat due to its poor imitation of Genesis physics, though better than Sonic 4's, and a spin dash with way too much power. Sonic's jump now sends him upward after destroying an enemy as opposed to a small bump off the top. This change directly affects gameplay, whereby Sonic can chain jump off of enemies, reaching new heights. I personally like this change despite it being inauthentic to classic games. It may be a bit too prominent, and I would rather see this boost in height rewarded for a player's timed re-input of jump, rather than being handed this height for landing on an enemy, especially when below them. The use of 3D assets would have been the perfect opportunity to tackle the camera issues plaguing classic design. When working in 3D, cameras can freely move in an environment where quality of the assets is not affected. Instead, with the exception of set-piece moments, which are probably the highlight of all these stages, the camera remains static and denies players more information ahead of them. This feeling is exacerbated by how incredibly powerful the spin dash is. If you blink, you'll miss Sonic leaving the screen and hope the level layout plays for you while you're rolling. Lives, timer, and continues all show up in classic fashion, with the inclusion of them beginning to show wear among modern game design trends. With the reintroduction of stages like Green Hill Zone and Chemical Plant Zone, a lack of innovation on any front, and even a subpar imitation of Genesis physics, Generations' classic gameplay feels like nostalgia bait rather than a genuine attempt at a 2.5D Sonic game. It would be another stretch of time, like being underwater with no oxygen, before 2D Sonic would return to the scene in all its glory. I think this is where we started. Sonic Mania feels and plays like a lost Genesis title. This is the true Sonic 4, a sequel in the same spirit of Sonic 1, 2, CD, and 3. If Sonic Mania was nothing more than a nostalgia-baiting cash grab, we would have very little to discuss. The locomotion is identical to that of the Genesis titles, carefully imitated to pixel-perfect accuracy. Sonic has a new mechanic in the drop dash, designed for players to switch direction quickly or maintain momentum while platforming. The levels are a great blend of exploration and looping hills, with nostalgia-ridden levels like Green Hill and Chemical Plant Zone reimagined with more loops, new sections, and even original gimmicks. Cutscene level transitions are back from Sonic 3. Giant rings are hidden through levels with a completely new, challenging special stage. However, not all is well with Mania. There are issues plaguing these design choices. The classic games are beginning to show their wear, especially when compared to other video games of the past decade. For starters, the claustrophobic camera has reared its ugly head again, along with the cumbersome timer, scoreboard, and life counter, all of which feel like relics of a bygone era in video games. Mania got so much right in the vein of classic experiences, and yet after asking for a return to classic for so long, my other video game experiences in between Sonic had soured what I once enjoyed in the Genesis titles. What were those games, you ask? What were those experiences? Well, let's back up a few years. In 2009, Demon's Souls was released to critical acclaim but was a sleeper hit, quickly becoming a cult classic. Players who stuck with the game's punishing difficulty were met with a game which respected players' intellect and time. Players would lose all progress made in the level along with their collected souls, acting as both experience points and currency, if they died without vanquishing a demon, serving as checkpoint and end of the act. Players would then have the opportunity to recollect their lost souls if they made it back to the scene of the crime. If they perished before successfully returning to where they previously lost their souls, the souls would be lost to the void, gone forever. Demon's Souls' minor success would give the director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, another shot at a title in the same vein. This game would define a decade. Released in 2011, Dark Souls would innovate in three major ways on Demon's Souls' solid action RPG experience. 1. Players would have access to a vast interconnected world to explore, with areas reserved for better skilled or higher level players accessible at the start. Secondly, players now had checkpoints throughout the world via bonfires, areas of respite and safety from harm. In Demon's Souls, bonfires were reserved for defeating bosses, marking the end of a stage rather than a safe place to take refuge before continuing your journey. In Dark Souls, using a bonfire resets enemy locations, allows you to level up specific stats with the amassed souls, and refills the third innovation, Estus Flask. Now, healing potions are nothing new to games, but the punishing difficulty of Miyazaki's vision made the use of an Estus Flask a weightier matter for players, with the starting amount only limited to 3 chugs and refills only available at bonfires. Dark Souls would put Miyazaki's name on the map and his influence would garner cultural acclaim. Later that same year, Ubisoft would breathe life into its own platforming mascot, Rayman and Rayman Origins, bringing the armless Beach Boy back to the XY dimensions with vibrant, lively environments and lots of charm. Players would pick from up to 4 different but equally jovial, rubbery characters sprinting through levels, scaling walls, and freeing bearded wizards and crowns. With a sharp sense of momentum and responsiveness, controlling Rayman and friends is intuitive and reactionary rather than memorization-based. During slow moments, the camera is zoomed in, with Rayman being clearly visible on screen and some of the environment being visible as well. During higher speed sections, the camera dynamically pans out to give players more information to make faster decisions. With this camera, Rayman has entire levels where the character is nearly lost amid the environment due to how small he appears, yet these segments test skill and reflexes rather than place the player in an on-rails experience. I remember thinking a few years later this was the type of facelift Sonic needed. In 2015, Microsoft Studios would produce developer Moon Studios' debut title, Ori and the Blind Forest. Ori innovates on Metroidvania platforms in 2 distinct ways: the instant checkpoint, which would be cut in the sequel, and the bash ability. Instant checkpoints can be created at the cost of energy, a resource akin to mana. Here, not only has a save state been created, but players have access to Ori's skill tree while navigating her storybook world. This allows players a moment to theory craft their skill tree direction as they explore. If you sense danger up ahead, an instant save point will go a long way in giving you a sigh of relief in case you take lethal damage. Secondly, Ori's kit is outfitted from head to toe in lethal powerful skills, abilities, and movement options. She can climb and hop off walls, double jump, glide slowly via leaf, and most importantly, she can bash. An early upgrade, the bash uses single targets as a launch point for Ori in the direction of the player's choosing within a tight window indicated by audio-visual cues. What's unique about the bash is the freedom it gives players to platform around enemies. Bash is both an offensive and platforming ability. As you send Ori rocketing through the air, the launch point, be it foe or foe creation, will be sent in the opposite direction, serving as platform ability, puzzle solution, and offensive retort. Bash functionally has no cooldown and consumes no resources, so entire sequences of the game are built around this mechanic and reflexive use of it. Ori succeeds in also having a healthy camera. Zooming in and out dynamically is needed for storytelling beats and platforming sequences. The level of empowerment given by the bash on top of other abilities, the mobile access to a skill system and a dynamic camera make Ori, along with its other countless strengths, like say the art for crying out loud, a joy to experience. This level of empowerment with on-screen information and reflexive expectation of players reminds me of a smaller indie game, a competitive platformer called Speedrunners. In Speedrunners, up to 4 players race against each other over obstacles and through hazards until the last one stands and the others have perished to the edge of the screen. Players run, jump, dive, and grapple their way through obstacles and hazards. What really stands out to me about speedrunners is how fast players move and yet how much of the environment is visible to them on screen. This information does not dictate the winner since all players have access to the same on-screen information. Instead, this opens up avenues for players to be expressive, clever, and skilled at how they maneuver in the here and now to affect how they perform down the road. Despite giving players a wide range of information, there are plenty of challenges that no amount of visual information makes easier. It's up to the player to perform. And finally, in 2017, just months before Sonic Mania, the world was gifted, via the generous backing of thousands of
viewers like you. Thank you.
Hollow Knight. Enter Tim Burton meets Bug's Life. Cute, creepy critters patrol the underbelly of a mountainous metropolis where one small beetle braves the darkness below. Hollow Knight is probably my favorite game of all time. It's a game I look at and think, I wish I had done that, and I think I can do that. Coming back to the game design, we have a solid Metroidvania platformer partnered with directional swordplay, wall climbing, double jumps, and dashes. What Hollow Knight revolutionizes in game design is its charm system. Instead of having columns of skill categories with branches you reach for, players find, buy, and collect a range of gameplay alterations called charms. Charms are a thoughtful approach to promoting player agency over their skill crafting, giving players customizability over gameplay styles and needs. Players collect charms and charm notches, the slots they're equipped in, as they progress in the game. Not all charms are made the same. The more powerful the charm, the more notches they take up, indicated by the white circles on the charm. They don't fundamentally change gameplay in a significant way, rather they enhance gameplay. A longer sword reach, faster striking, faster healing, more powerful spells, more energy when hitting enemies, less damage taken, more damage dished out, etc. They don't, for example, give the knight a grapple hook he can swing from, or a third jump, or an on-screen flash that triggers the end of the game. A gameplay enhancement system of this kind could find a home in a Sonic title if we rethink how a few things are handled first. Back to the original question, where does 2D Sonic go from here? Rather than simply add another ball form ability, or create more original stages, gimmicks, and badniks, produce more original music, or redesign Sonic's pixel art for the nth time, instead of all these wonderful things the Sonic fan game community is great at, let's take a stab at reimagining classic Sonic formula. How about we reimagine the arcade remnants of Sonic games and turn this iconic mascot into a product of its time? Evaluating what made the original game so special, I conclude the characters, the music, the levels, the momentum-based gameplay, and the rings made the magic happen. The scoreboard, timer, and lives were sufficient systems in their time, but to evolve requires letting go of some of those initial design choices. Rings are integral to Sonic, and need to be reimagined rather than let go. I think making rings more central to gameplay rather than feeling so optional, except in 3 quantities, is necessary. You may think with the mentions of Hollow Knight and Dark Souls I'm a glutton for punishment, and I am, but I'm not here to propose the Dark Souls of Sonic. Instead, I'm interested in mechanically rich games that demand the attention of its players. A game less based on memory and more based on reaction. And for whatever reason, memorization doesn't bother me in other games, but it always has in Sonic titles, and I think the lack of visual information provided by the camera is my main gripe. Games like Celeste or Super Meat Boy, which are all about memorization through trial and error, enthrall me. But Sonic feels like he should be more about riding around in a skate park performing cool tricks like a free runner, and less about jumping precisely or having level layouts memorized. I don't want button presses to be predetermined or rote or even rhythmic. I want players to improvise, dance, and play a tune with their controllers or keyboards or what have you. I want players to have the same sense of acrobatics and power Sonic is given in media and game cutscenes, but we've never gotten to personally experience. Here's my practical response. A take on the formula aimed at modernizing the classic games. Sonic Freedom, a 2D, hand-drawn, Metroidvania-inspired version of Sonic. The core philosophy around Freedom is to give players the tools they need to deal with any situation without taking any control away. Rather than design mechanics with strict case use, players' repertoire in Sonic never changes and behaves consistently across all encounters. I chose a hand-drawn art style for a few reasons. 1, it's something I think I'm capable of doing. 2, the biggest inspirations are also hand-drawn, Rayman, Ori, and Hollow Knight. 3, it hadn't been attempted when I started working on it. 4, I'm no good at pixel art and I don't have a desire to dabble in this medium. And 5, it's been my childhood dream to be able to play the Sonic CD intro. Here's what we have so far. Sonic is still momentum-based, though he now accelerates and decelerates faster. He has a speed cap so players never lose control. I'm in favor of player agency. A dynamic camera has been implemented to give players the right amount of information based on the speed they're going. In Freedom, gameplay is designed around 3 main buttons. Jump, a freedom ability, which is a traversal reflex mechanic of some kind, and a special ability, an offensive movement option, which costs 5 ring to use. Sonic's special ability is a bash-inspired translation of the homing attack into 2D I've termed the Bullet Dash. It has 360-degree rotational control, but does not require a single target to activate. Bullet Dash resets on badniks or item destruction and deflects projectiles for a brief period. Sonic's Freedom ability is Parkour, doubling as a cool-looking wall climb and a dodge roll. Parkour can be used at any time, is directionally influenced by the control stick, and requires no resource to use. When used near a wall, Sonic will stick to the surface, allowing a brief moment for players to adjust direction or calculate the next move. While active, Sonic has a flash of invulnerability with the trade-off of doing no damage, which is important for ring collection since badniks now grant 5 rings when destroyed, but we'll get to rings shortly. Players can also freely swap between rolling and unrolling, or curling and uncurling respectively. This gives players choice and agency over moment-to-moment gameplay. The life counter, an archaic design choice from the days of inserting flat metal cylinders into slits in gaming refrigerators, has been removed. Likewise, the timer is gone, which is no longer needed for the emphasis on exploration and a de-emphasis on moving from A to B. The UI has been stripped down to what really matters, ring count with the addition of ring gauge. Rings no longer count towards pointless scoreboards, lives, continues, or access to special stage rings. Instead, rings are essentially HP, mana, and currency all rolled into one. Rings should be more than a single hit point or a ticket stub at an attempt at a Chaos Emerald. Let me explain my crazy, completely far out from the classics idea, okay? Sonic now has a health bar I'm calling ring gauge. I never thought I'd introduce HP into Freedom. I really didn't. But after removing lives, continues, and 1 ring as health, this actually seems like the proper evolution. Players will start with a single meter, indicating a single hit point. It takes 10 rings to recover a single gauge. However, players must stop to charge briefly and convert 10 rings into 1 meter, not dissimilar to Hollow Knight's health system. If you do not have a single gauge meter filled, Sonic will expel all his collected rings, this is his last hit, at which point your ring gauge will begin to warn you of your impending fate. Players can recollect fallen rings this time, but being hit a second time with no ring gauge will result in death and all rings garnered lost. This means no amount of rings will save you if you do not have a single bar of ring gauge once depleted. Since sharing my thoughts on this topic in a couple of rambly recorded videos, I've already received some healthy skepticism in regards to these systems. The most common pushback I've received is, "This is too complex," and "Rings are beautiful in their simplicity in the Genesis games." And I agree with both of these. Except rings are only a single part of the system in the Genesis titles. Rings are lifelines, which includes your life counters, continues, scoreboard, and timer. It's all connected and equally complex. When thinking about how rings could work after removing all those archaic design choices of the arcade era, we stumble into new territory with how rings could function. I'm funneling all those systems into rings at the center. Rings are your lifeline, health bar, currency, and mana resource. How are they like mana? Well, special abilities will cost 5 rings to use. Badniks grant 5 rings, so killing one will instantly grant access to your special ability. This allows me to set up chains of enemies to destroy without depleting player resources and punishing a failed chain, which is just frustrating and not inherently challenging. Remember checkpoints and how they merely served as a failsafe in case players died in a level? Let's make checkpoints a bit more interesting. For starters, they're few and far in between and they're well hidden out of sight. You can now fast travel between checkpoints. Checkpoints also have shops where you can purchase a shield, fast shoes, or invincibility. Ideally, checkpoints will also be where Sonic can equip and purchase ring enchantments, my sonified version of Hollow Knight's charm system, boons which improve upon base gameplay without fundamentally changing it. You'll be able to swap between characters here as well. Checkpoints are now a source of respite and retooling stations. I think the ring gauge and ring enchantment systems remain faithful to the classics by having rings stay as a lifeline, with the added trade-off of access to new abilities, items, and encouraging going out of your way for that one ring pack over there, which you may be able to use at the next checkpoint, to shop with. By having a higher minimum amount needed for surviving a hit, and having built-in purposes for larger collections, rings no longer seem like a hot or cold dilemma but serve as currency, health point, and resource pool, making them important at any moment in the game. Now onto the camera. Sonic's camera does not just need to be moved to the right while moving as Dimps tried in Sonic Advance and Rush. Sonic is much too powerful a platforming character for this change to solve all its current ills. In Freedom, the camera, much like aforementioned platformer titles, is dynamic, zoomed in while Sonic is idle or gaining speed, and progressively zooming out relative to the player's speed. The faster a player moves, the more empowered they need to be with on-screen information. Sonic Freedom is a Metroidvania-inspired romp. There is no signpost in Freedom, no A to B goal. So what do you do in this world? Well, in classic games, exploring nook and crannies led you to goodies like extra lives, more rings, a new shield, or giant rings, which led you to Chaos Emeralds. Cosmic jewels are now floating around in the environment and are fragmented into 3 pieces per jewel, making a total of 21 to find and locate throughout the world. Collecting 3 will restore 1 to its former glory and grant players 1 Time Stone point. Time Stone points can be spent at checkpoints to upgrade ring gauge or add a ring enchantment slot to the player, not dissimilar to Spirit Orbs in Breath of the Wild. Instead of having multiple zones, I'm using a single zone, think of it as a theme similar to classic zones, with 4 interconnected biomes. These are variations on this theme. Tangled Lake Zone is the locale in Freedom, with each biome having a distinct feel, playstyle, and even unique badniks. The main forested area is where the players will start off after completing the tutorial. This is your typical blue plus yellow hued hill zone, with a little bit of Palm Tree Panic thrown in, a blend of all the playstyles you'll encounter. You can expect to see changes in scenery and gameplay as you move closer to the other biomes. To the right is a beach with open water running sections and vertical cliffs to scale. Right above the forest are moving, flowing vine highways reminiscent of Chemical Plant and Stardust Speedway. Moving to the bottom left, we have dense, dark jungle with slower paced platforming and methodical maneuvering. Each biome will ideally have ways they all connect to one another, whether it's obvious or more hidden. And what about those water levels we discussed earlier? How do we deal with this for Sonic games? I propose we keep Sonic's core anchoring to the underwater level below, but nerf the power of water on Sonic's speed. Sonic can now parkour across the top of water, no longer requiring top speed for skipping these sections. Replace his special ability with an underwater dash that can destroy enemies and be reused immediately with a slight influence to direction and art. Introduce a boon that removes oxygen requirements, as it's simply artificial difficulty and an unnecessary resource to keep track of, but we still want players to work for that burden to be lifted. I don't believe my solution is the solution, it's just my perspective on the future of 2D Sonic. Freedom is meant to be an exploration into the potential of a modernized Sonic title, a game not bogged down by the past or technical limits, but uplifted by the titles it inspired. Sonic is an icon of platformers and games as a whole. It's time Sonic let the games he helped create uplift him into something new and bright. Sonic should be a fun, fast, twitchy, explorative game. Simply moving him around should be a delight, as this is something Sonic himself takes much joy in. A future 2D Sonic title should capture the ethos of the character, not just wade in the waters he started in. If you want to follow the development of Sonic Freedom, follow @SonicFreedom_ on Twitter. For video development, follow the Sonic Freedom YouTube channel, recently created and curated by yours truly. If you're interested in being part of the project, my DMs are open on Twitter @TripleJazz. We're currently looking for programmers who are experienced with C# and Unity. The framework for Freedom is the Freedom engine by Marmito TH, an OG of the dev team. You can poke around in this free engine to see if you'd be a good fit. Link in description. Genesis Sonic innovated on platforms in a way that was distinct and memorable, but over time has failed to adapt to modern trends. Trends which I think have greatly pushed 2D platformers in a positive direction. Aspects like the timer, scoreboard, lives, and continues all reek of an old-timey, arcade, bygone era of games. The camera was made for a specific art medium during a time when technology couldn't scale pixel art properly, all the while punishing players who were new to the experience or didn't play often enough to completely memorize levels. Rings are a hot or cold purpose, leaving a lukewarm feeling like an undercooked Trader Joe's meal. It's okay to add new abilities to Sonic that enhance player experience, allowing them to move about the world with more freedom and decision-making power. There doesn't need to be a compromise on the integrity of the classic games to evolve Sonic as a platformer. I believe Sonic needs to take cues from modern games outside its purview, which have done much to innovate on the 2D genre as a whole. Sonic deserves a good future, which seeks to rejuvenate the classic formula with new ideas and new approaches to overall gameplay experience, empowering player agency rather than relying on set-piece moments and hand-holding level design. What do you think the future of 2D Sonic should look like? Thanks for watching. I'll leave a link to the Windows Alpha for Sonic Freedom in the description so you can play it for yourself. Keep in mind this alpha does not have all the ideas discussed here implemented just yet. I also want to give a standing ovation to the Lizard Legion for supporting the channel. I want to personally give a shout out to Chip Chap Chop, Opic, Giganut, Dennis Little, Anna Stepanova, and Mind Guy RBLX. Join the Lizard Legion for custom emojis during my live streams, a Slink avatar on screen during live streams, archived live streams, and early access to all my videos. Plus, get a say in what I do during my live streams. Join using the pinned comment below.